Well, joining me now for more on this is Timothy Lytton. He's a professor at Georgia State University College of Law. Good to have you on the program, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Plenty to unpack here. I want to start with this 2005 Act we just heard about, which shields gun makers. How airtight is this protection? And talk to us about some of the loopholes that might give families of victims themselves a chance to sue the companies which manufacture the weapons used in mass shootings.
Starting in the 1990s and early 2000s, gun violence victims started to sue firearms manufacturers for injuries that they suffered from criminal misuse of the weapons. And these lawsuits started to proliferate, and cities also started to bring lawsuits to try and recoup some of the costs of dealing with gun violence. And these lawsuits against the firearms manufacturers prompted the United States Congress to pass an immunity shield called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And that act essentially says that a person may not sue a firearms manufacturer for any kind of injury that arises out of criminal misuse of a weapon. So that essentially cut off most of this litigation to a trickle. The basic idea of the litigation is that there are decisions that firearms manufacturers make about gun designs and the lethality of weapons, and there were arguments that those design decisions are unreasonably dangerous, and therefore the firearms manufacturer should be held accountable for any kind of injuries that result when their guns are criminally misused. The other kinds of theories are related to marketing and distribution, the idea that firearms manufacturers are over-promoting their weapons or promoting them in ways that lead to heightened risk of criminal misuse. So this liability shield essentially was a way to block this type of litigation. There are a number of exceptions, and the most notable one that you've mentioned already is that a firearms manufacturer is not immune from suit if they violate a state law or a federal law that's applicable to the sale of a firearm. So some plaintiffs recently have been arguing that firearms manufacturers are selling their weapons in violation of state nuisance laws that are generally designed to cover all sorts of activities, including firearms, but many other things as well, such as operating a business, and that on that basis they can bring a lawsuit under the exception to the PLACA immunity shield.
Right. So I want to piggyback on this when you talked about the breaching of the public nuisance law. Talk to us about that strategy and how likely it is to work for these victims.
Well, there's a disagreement in American courts about this strategy. The federal courts in New York and California that have heard these lawsuits have argued that when the exception to PLACA says that a firearms manufacturer is liable for violating a state statute applicable to the sale of firearms, that means it has to be a statute that specifically regulates firearm sales, and general public nuisance statutes don't regulate specifically firearm sales. They regulate all sorts of activities. And on that basis, this theory was rejected by the New York Court of the New York Federal Court and also the Federal Appeals Court in California. However, two state courts have accepted this theory, arguing that applicable to the sale of a firearm means that the statute can be generally applicable, not specifically applicable. And that's what we saw in the Sandy Hook case, where Remington Arms ultimately settled with the Sandy Hook families. There's another case in Indiana where the city of Indiana sued firearms manufacturers, claiming that they violated a public nuisance statute that was generally applicable, including to firearms. And that case is still working its way through the Indiana courts. It was filed in 1999, and it's still going 23 years later.
Professor, I wish we had more time, but we'll have to leave it there. Timothy Lytton, professor at Georgia State University College of Law. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.